Dear colleagues and friends, old and not so old, thank you very much for coming along to this lecture this evening, and I'm very pleased to see so many of you here from all parts of the university and indeed from the wider world. My slightly salacious, seductive title has obviously done its job, but I'm afraid it's all very tame from here on in. So my apologies in advance for those who were expecting something a little more spicy. Spicy it is not, but I hope it is revealing in some ways. As we know, there are always 3 lectures for every one you give. The one you write, the one you give, and the one which you wish you had given. And at the end of this, I'll make up my mind, and I guess you'll make up yours as well. This is actually my 3rd professorial inaugural lecture, though clearly my first one here in Birmingham. And by the end of it, I really should feel well and truly inaugurated, or perhaps the word is relieved. I have, of course, been in my role here for over 2 years, and it has been a positive, rich, and immersive experience, and not without its challenges. But that's the way it should be, for without challenges, it's easy to lapse into routine, complacency, and a narrowness of vision. And I hate complacency, and I react against routine and narrow vision. And I've been very pleased to link up with colleagues across and beyond the university that share my feelings and have been so encouraging and helpful. Only last week, I was at the University of Illinois, where their Chancellor and our Vice-Chancellor signed off on an important strategic alliance between our 2 universities. And being part of this process for the past 2 years, what struck me during the visit was just what can be achieved by having a bold and expansive vision worthy of a great university. But before I launch into the lecture proper, I'd just like to take a moment to say a few thank yous. Now, it's okay, I'm not going to go down the Academy Awards speech where I thank my ancestors and the cat, but I do want to say thanks to all of my colleagues across the college and the university who have supported me, and I hope will continue to do so, in my endeavours to reposition the Ironbridge International Institute for Cultural Heritage and to realise its full potential as a global player in the cultural heritage field. And my thanks also have to be extended to the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust, its chairman, its chief executive, senior management team, and my fellow board members. The Trust, with its 10 museums, the Ironbridge Gorge World Heritage Site, the extensive landscape of this most remarkable part of England, is integral to the success of the Institute and is also one of the unique assets of this university. Okay, thank yous over, and now to the focus of my lecture this evening. Given that my institute works closely with the World Heritage Site, and since that my arriving here, I've been trying to highlight the uniqueness of this relationship, I had no option but to speak tonight on the subject of World Heritage. Sorry, this is the lecture you hoped I was going to do. However, as I hope to elaborate, much of what I have to say applies to all aspects of what we term heritage. If the world really is everything that is the case, then it is composed of all what the past leaves us, what we have individually and collectively inherited. Stripped bare, what we really have in the world is what anthropologist Daniel Miller explores as stuff. A wonderfully dense and messy concept that stands for artifacts, objects and things, and also people. It's stuff that animates and is animated by the immateriality of ideas, beliefs, values, rules, language, and the like. We inherit stuff and continually produce more stuff for future generations. What we commonly term heritage is not additional to this stuff, but is what we choose to value from it. Again, both individually and collectively. No longer is the label of heritage laid upon the world solely by official institutions, structured processes, or through paternalistic state interventions. Increasingly, it is constructed through individual and community practices, discourses, and performances that are ad hoc, reactive, cathartic, and grounded in the search for meaning and identity. We live with our own personal heritages every day. We work within collective heritage, which shapes our social and cultural identity. The ability and desire to order the world is an extensive trait of the human species. We work with ontological categories that help us make sense of the world, and it appears that in this category of heritage, diverse, complex, and contested though it is, we have found a useful means to curate the world. No longer do we feel the need to wait centuries, even decades, before we don't denote some part of life, some object, some experience, some collective memory as heritage. Star Trek is heritage. Star Wars is heritage. A cursory visit to that wonderful website of eBay will show us that in many ways heritage is broken free of its institutional moorings and is embedded in everyday life to be consumed, collected, traded, displayed, used, and admired. The rise of the virtual museum, along with the Sunday morning car boot fair and the digital camera, are all part of a redrawing of the boundaries of heritage. Nevertheless, we still look towards the instruments of the state to preserve, validate, and construct heritage. We default, in the main, to what Laura Jane Smith refers to as the authorised heritage discourse, an officially scripted and informed understanding of what heritage is and also what it should be. The past, the passing of time, and the stuff of the world is inevitable. Heritage, on the other hand, is not inevitable. Rather, it comes into the world, into our consciousness, because we give it a place in our lives. It is both invention and a discovery. Arguably, it is one of mankind's most successful inventions, a constantly accumulating category, broad and diverse enough to be meaningful to just about everyone. Its limits are elastic, and yet it can provide us with some stability, a rootedness, a focus for social cohesion, and a sense of who and where we are. When I was a boy, not that long ago, there was no heritage. Or rather, I was not aware of it. Rather, I was preoccupied with life's other pleasures. But I was fascinated by the space race. And at the time of the first moon landing, it seemed that the future was to be full of robots, 3-course meals in a little pill, and telephones where we could actually see the people who we were talking to. And we didn't have to press the A and B button. Some of you in the audience will get that, some won't. The outlook was to the future, even to life beyond the earth. And heritage was not the preoccupation of the wider public. At least it did not seem that way in my hometown of Sunderland, where shipbuilding was still industry, not industrial heritage. It was to the future that communities looked for justice, liberty, and peace. Now, as a slightly older boy, it seems that we live in a world of heritage. Within a relatively short period of time, it appears that in looking for development, progress, and meaning, our focus has shifted from the future and beyond this world more to the past, which is very much anchored on our own planet. And now the world is full of heritage. We are surrounded by the material and immaterial markers of the past. From the diminished Ozymandian legacies of grand civilizations to the grand remains of diminished civilizations, from the prompts of what we would like to remember to the nasty stains that we may wish to forget, from museums of everything to the Antiques Roadshow, from steam trains to Downton Abbey, from state-sanctioned commemorations of great battles to 1970s themed nightclubs. We are wanderers in the world of heritage. There is an ongoing and rapid dialogical relationship between our production of heritage and our consumption of it. And when we have had our fill of our own heritage, we seek out the heritage of others. Those that could travel have always travelled to see the heritage of others. Indeed, as a form of material colonialism, the objects of the other frequently travel back to adorn the walls of museums and large houses of the developed world. The dramatic expansion of international tourism to a point where few areas of the planet remain untouched by the tourist is closely tied to the expansion of what we may term the heritage industry. We are encouraged to be tourists of heritage sites and increasingly encouraged to see these sites in the context of what John Tomlinson terms the culture of immediacy, before we die. I'm not offering any value judgment here, but merely rehearsing that the relationships between us and the world of heritage are multifaceted and complex and bound to processes of global imagining and resemanticisation. Previously solid and sacred words such as tradition and authenticity are no longer so. The narratives of heritage that were designed for perpetuity are challenged by the messy and shifting realities of globalisation, of which tourism is a part. Now, with some caveats, I'm a big fan of tourism and the tourist, a category to which we all belong, precisely because it holds within it the possibilities for development and intercultural dialogue, exchange and understanding that were once the promise of the space age. However, I well understand that the relationship between heritage and tourism is often conceived of as being oppositional. But the key point for me is that heritage and tourism, as categories, as actions, as systems of understanding, are incapable of being disinvented. They are powerful global realities and intimately linked. And so to the world of world heritage, a supra category of heritage that we have invented. When asked the question of how old is the World Heritage Site of the Pyramids of Giza, it would seem instinctive to give the answer of approximately 4,500 years. Of course, the World Heritage Site of Memphis and its necropolis and the pyramid fields from Giza to Dashur, as it's officially called, will celebrate its 35th anniversary this year. For this is the great irony of world heritage. It is a very modern idea, indeed a very modernist idea. The 1972 Convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage was put in place only 3 years after men first landed on the moon, and marked in its own way a crossing point between the optimism of future possibilities and the lessons of the past. The meta-message of World Heritage is a courageous, positive and powerful one. There are tangible reminders of the past which have the capacity to remind us all, now and in the future, of the successes and failures of humanity. We should remind ourselves that World Heritage is a project of UNESCO in the context of the United Nations, and born out of 20th century turmoil, war, ignorance, and the ongoing threat of physical and intellectual destruction. To believe in and speak of concepts such as mankind, the international community, common humanity, and critically outstanding universal value back in 1972 was a very bold venture and very much part of a modernist vision of the world. It also revealed an interesting intellectual continuity with Enlightenment thinking, particularly in its evocation of Kantian notions of both moral value and aesthetic taste applied to both the works of man and nature. Kant saw moral value as absolute and unique, and beauty as objective, having universal validity and capable of being arrived at through a rationality that was also seen to be universal. In picking through the text of the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, indeed the numerous documents and charters that fed into it, in particular the Hague Convention and the Venice Charter, and within the various iterations of the operational guidelines for the implementation of the Convention, there are footprints of Kantian philosophy which adheres to this belief in universalism. This is only reflecting the UNESCO rationale of the intellectual and moral solidarity of mankind. This is a gracious and worthy statement, and one that is difficult to disagree with. The values enshrined in the 1972 Convention are fundamental core values, and I stand by my earlier reflections that within the parameters it sets itself, the Convention remains a remarkable, prescient and powerful transnational intervention. The ideas of universalism and transcendence and the language through which these are expressed are powerfully seductive. In particular, the term world encourages us to imagine a genuine sense of transnational governance, a global authority that somehow acts in favour of all humanity. This is given additional credence by the fact that 190 states have ratified the Convention, and there is strength in numbers. Through the state signatories to the Convention, UNESCO fills a role as guardian of cultural and natural heritage under threat. It is recognised to be unique and irreplaceable, and whose deterioration or disappearance would constitute a harmful impoverishment of the heritage of all the nations of the world, presumably including the handful of nations that have not signed up to the Convention. At one level, it could be argued that to be included in the World Heritage List is to acknowledge the fragility and uniqueness of a particular site and an awareness that it is under threat. At another level, this could be seen to suggest the weakness of governance for heritage on the part of the member states and their inability to protect their own sites. In cases relating to developing countries where the principles and practices of heritage management and appropriate legislation for site protection have not fully evolved, intervention through the efforts of UNESCO as a response is very welcome. Reading the sheer number of sites now designated as World Heritage and taking into account the largely unaltered text of the Convention, it would seem that there have never been so many heritages in need of protection. Locating World Heritage within a wider understanding of global sociology is helpful in allowing us to understand the desire to be part of what Eliot and Schmutz term the universal cultural order. The world as a holistic entity, as something greater than the sum of its parts, which implies action and conduct which is global in scope. It's a distinctly modernist idea, and it's paralleled in the development of modern environmentalism and language which emerged from the United Nations Stockholm Declaration on the human environment, dating from the same year as the World Heritage Convention. As Joanne Pemberton has argued through her examination of the global metaphor, the idea of the global is highly seductive, with a rhetoric that pervades the cultural sphere as well as economic and technological interests and is ready-made for political discourse. The very word world is laden with expectations and assumptions that are made manifest when it is accepted and applied. It carries within it several meanings. It implies universal acknowledgement, akin to the notion of a world championship, where out of the process of contestation between several, a winner emerges. It implies ranking and reward, where World Heritage receives a metaphorical gold medal, and as a consequence, other heritage sites do not. It also creates what Michael Hertzfeld terms a global hierarchy of values that manifests itself in policy decisions and resource allocations. To be a World Heritage Site is to have participated in the process of evaluation. At one level, this is a kind of accreditation, an outcome of or reward for matching up to a set of widely accepted criteria, however contested they may be. A heritage site, property or landscape is tested against the overarching concept of outstanding universal value. Now, this term has long been debated inside and outside of UNESCO and continues to remain the fundamental condition for the inscription of World Heritage since the first 12 sites were inscribed in 1978. And there have been various attempts made to examine and refine the concept and the way that it is mobilised in selecting sites for the World Heritage List. Over the years, the criteria have been refined, and since a review of the operational guidelines in 2005, there are now 10 criteria, the first 6 dealing in the main with cultural heritage and the remaining 4 dealing with natural heritage. The operational guidelines themselves have undergone several reviews, and in the normative courses of events have remained sacrosanct in the listing of World Heritage, although we can identify ways in which they have been interpreted. Christina Cameron, in a keynote paper to a special expert meeting on the World Heritage Convention in Kazan in 2005, identified that during the mid-1980s, the interpretation of the term outstanding universal value shifted from something which equated to best of the best, which was in effect applied to sites which were already recognised as being iconic, to an interpretation of sites being representative of the best. In the operational guidelines which came into being in 2005, outstanding universal value was defined as being so exceptional as to transcend national boundaries, to be of common importance for present and future generations of all humanity. This is a powerful claim, but it begs so many questions. In what ways do World Heritage Sites transcend national boundaries? How does this transcendental value manifest itself? And what is actually meant by the term common importance? And important in what sense? Despite elaborate and nuanced discussions which have taken place over the years, this core concept has remained. And adjustments have been what we might call slight or even reinforcing. Value is largely defined as relating to the material being of the site, with emphasis upon issues such as integrity and authenticity. Historical values, along with artistic or aesthetic values, are given primacy in what the former president of ICOMOS, Michael Petset, has referred to as classical values. We can see the lineage tracing itself back to Enlightenment thought, with this emphasis upon non-instrumental values, almost in a self-generating and self-sustaining way, to produce, via rational and objective process, world heritage. But whatever intellectual challenges the concept generates, the key point is it has accepted authority through the signatories to the convention, an authority that has also been accentuated through accumulated practice. In principle, a claim as to what constitutes outstanding universal value needs to be clear and unambiguous. In practice, it is a matter of judgment, collectively arrived at and based on experience that is inevitably relative, subjective, and where the line between World Heritage winners and losers is a very fine one. This is not to denigrate the subjectivity of the approach, but merely to recognise it. To have a World Heritage Site within a region or nation state carries considerable symbolic value. The value of having some mark of global status is part of the process of identity construction. In the same way that world champions in sport are appropriated by nation states, regions, cities, and even more localised communities. Being acknowledged as having a World Heritage Site is a way of participating in the world. To be able to display the World Heritage Badge is to be a member of the being part of the world club. And in part it helps to explain the desire for nations to keep proffering candidates for inscription. While heritage is widely held up as an instrument of nation building, at the same time, and rather counterintuitively, this is also has to be seen as wishing to participate in the globalising, interconnected world. As I was proudly told by a senior official almost immediately when I was visiting Lithuania a few years ago, we have twice as many World Heritage Sites as Latvia. In fact, Lithuania has 4 sites, and it shares one with Latvia, and it shares the other one with Russia. But the enthusiasm in such a declaration has behind it the story of a major cultural readjustment for this post-socialist state. What is telling about the World Heritage List as it approaches 1,000 sites is not only the burgeoning number of properties already inscribed, but the longer list of properties which have been submitted to the tentative list, the waiting room for global recognition. At present, this stands at 1,576 properties put forward by 176 states. The average number of sites inscribed on the World Heritage List each year since its first year of 1978 is 28. Roughly speaking, and assuming no change in the number of tentative properties, upwards or downwards, this would keep UNESCO busy for the next 54 years or so. Do we read this as the success of the convention? An improved recognition of heritage that transcends borders? A triumph of globalism? A re-emergence of nationalism? A game too easily played in the dilution of value? A meta-search for identity? Disenchantment with the present and lack of faith in the future? Or economic desperation and the need for a new type of resource to feed development? Inevitably, there are arguments for each, and indeed all such readings, and several issues emerge, and I will consider only 2. The first relates to the notion of having. For while having World Heritage status can be and is widely proclaimed by a member nation state, it is signalling the movement to the realms of global ownership for the world and on behalf of the world. In legal terms, of course, this is not much more than metaphorical ownership. Moreover, legal ownership is not the same as moral ownership, and this brings up its own issues around the processes by which member states seek to inscribe sites and the level to which communities of interest are or are not involved in the process. A second issue returns to the seductive potency of the world concept. The privately instigated campaign of the new 7 World Wonders, the brainchild of Swiss-Canadian mobile phone millionaire Bernard Weber, who designated a category of important World Heritage Sites. This campaign, which began in 2002 and culminated in 2007 when the new 7 World Wonders were announced. And this clearly differed in its approach from UNESCO. Here the public voted for their favourite heritage site in open competition, using Weber's mobile phone company, and not surprisingly, nations voted for their own World Heritage Sites. The website for the campaign proudly proclaimed that the official new 7 World Wonders of the world have been elected by more than 100 million votes to represent global heritage throughout history. After initial liaison, UNESCO distanced itself from the initiative. What could loosely be termed an alternative, if shorter, list of world heritage was compiled over a short period of time and without any scientific scrutiny or detailed consideration. 7 sites were voted into existence, and all had already been inscribed on the World Heritage List. But what was interesting about the campaign despite the criticisms of UNESCO, was the way that it was enthusiastically embraced by the governments of the 20 finalists. It pointed to a desperate need for world recognition, and also to the exposure it gave such sites, which in the minds of supporting nations correlated to increased visitor numbers. While significant research is still lacking with regard to the impact of this campaign and subsequent initiatives relating to natural heritage and urban heritage, there is evidence that some sites did generate increased volumes of tourists through the exposure this campaign brought about. And so far I've mainly focused upon the lure of world heritage to nation states, but to what extent are we as individuals, almost always as tourists, seduced by them? It is difficult to think of World Heritage Sites without imagining swarms of tourists taking photographs, lines of parked tour buses and attendant souvenir stalls. Clearly this is the case amongst the more commonly studied and troubled sites such as Venice or the historic sites, centres of Florence and Rome, all of which are urban sites and actually long-standing tourist destinations anyway. The entanglements existing between World Heritage and tourism are in evidence across the marketing and communication networks that pervade the developed and developing world. Many destinations, whether at the national or regional scale, privilege World Heritage amongst their inventories of attractions in actions of genuine pride, but also in the knowledge that they carry an additional appeal for the tourist market. Tour operators devise their routes and itineraries to include World Heritage Sites as highlights. And there are operators that specialise in packaging World Heritage-centred itineraries. The British-based company Hurlingham Travel offers, somewhat unrealistically, the world's most expensive vacation. $1.5 million will allow you to see all of the World Heritage Sites in luxury, cutting through some 157 countries. While it appears that no one as yet has undertaken the tour, it demonstrates in the extreme the prestige that is loaded upon the World Heritage label. UNESCO itself plays to the realities of the iconic role of World Heritage Sites in national tourism marketing campaigns, and frequently carries advertisements for country destinations and national tourism organisations in its World Heritage magazine. Guidebooks similarly give prominence to World Heritage in their prescriptive narratives of destinations. Visual texts directed to prospective tourists through national advertising campaigns and filmic montages with an aim to provide an overview of a place in a limited time, again strongly feature images of World Heritage Sites. And in a similar vein, creative works of film, literature and commercial advertising have knowingly and unknowingly employed World Heritage Sites as both background and foreground for story purposes. In the vernacular recollections of journeys and holidays that now litter cyberspace in the form of blogs and personal diaries, replete as they are with copious photographs, visits to World Heritage Sites are accorded a degree of detail and reverence, and a visit to them has become a kind of social marker of achievement. What is important to note about these various representations of World Heritage and their intersections with tourism is that they speak of a process of both conscious and unconscious appropriation, whereby the sites, structures and landscapes which have been accorded outstanding universal value through UNESCO are then projected and promoted for possessing this value by agents that have had no direct input into the process of evaluation and assessment. Such appropriation is entirely rational on a number of grounds. First, for a tour operator or a destination marketing organisation, it is common sense to draw upon those resources that will attract tourists by virtue of their strong aesthetic appeal or some other feature that will promise the tourist a noteworthy experience. What we may term the attractiveness of World Heritage requires deeper interrogation, but it is not conform to any universalist doctrine. I remember being decidedly disenchanted when visiting the site of smashed-in Buffalo Head Jump in southern Alberta, which in my book goes down as one of the most boring World Heritage Sites there is. Baroque churches and cathedrals do nothing for me, and in the main I am not drawn to prehistoric World Heritage Sites. Now I may be atypical. My leading candidates for World Heritage listing would include the favelas of Rio, the townships of South Africa, Sellafield, Disneyland, and Blackpool, which almost made the UK's tentative list. However, the point remains is that beauty may well be in the eye of the tourist rather than that of ICOMOS and the World Heritage Committee. Nonetheless, the consistent and long-standing highlighting of World Heritage and tourism marketing campaigns does act to further embed sites into public consciousness and thus accentuates their value. They accrue their own social capital by virtue of their very presence in the public sphere. The overlap of World Heritage sites with the iconic markers of international travel and tourism that predate the 1972 convention, the pyramids of Giza, Statue of Liberty, Colosseum, Taj Mahal, points to a recognised value outside of the UNESCO process. And that resonates within a wider system of representation and a recognition that tourism taps into, and which Roland Barthes recognised in his well-known critique of the guidebook as a form of reductionism. Second, the ways in which the tourism sector draws on World Heritage speaks to an accepted authority of UNESCO and its transnational influence. Implicitly, this is an acceptance of the 10 criteria used to evaluate World Heritage and the overarching concept of outstanding universal value. Though not articulated as such, the vast, diverse and fragmented tourism sector that readily adopts the images and stories of World Heritage are effectively validating the power of UNESCO in deciding that some aspects of tangible cultural heritage are more important, more significant, more outstanding than others. This allows a tour operator or a destination to move away from saying that tourists should visit a site because the national or regional authorities suggest we should, but rather there is a higher authority with a more persuasive voice that can direct the tourist to something special. And related to what I've just mentioned, the layers of value that accumulate through the label of World Heritage and the additional pulling power this implies is perceived to bestow a potential economic premium in the form of increased volume of tourists, plus additional tourist-related development, mainly accommodation and retail. In terms of attracting increased tourist numbers, fundamental economic rationality entails that the category of World Heritage presents a market opportunity for those engaged in tourism. The diversity of sites, the dissemination of norms, the discourse of international conventions, together with the role played by international institutions and the mass media in the promotion and diffusion of World Heritage values, and what Marcotte and Bordeaux note as the brand reputation of both World Heritage and the UNESCO label, all point to the power and pervasiveness of a universalist perspective, and to this meta-narrative of unity in diversity with the World Heritage List as the emblematic expression of this. One aspect of a growing disenchantment with World Heritage process, or at least a slow realisation, is the fact that inscription on the list is not normally accompanied by additional resources for site protection. A World Heritage Fund does exist to allow UNESCO to support remedial work for urgently threatened sites, but this is extremely limited, totaling at the moment only $4 million. Rather, being on the World Heritage List implies a long-term resource commitment, with finances required for the management of the site, and in a sense this could be increasingly seen to be a disincentive to states to nominate sites for inscription. Looking forward, the combination of higher costs, an economic recession, or at least a realignment of financial priorities, may well slow down the World Heritage listing process. It would seem that instances of deterioration of properties due to a lack of resource, are scheduled to increase. And with the real lack of interventionary power and finance that all that UNESCO and the World Heritage Committee has to work with are the sanctions of flagging the site as being in danger and ultimately delisting or debranding the site. At the same time, in an attempt to see the glass half full rather than half empty, sites will need to be more productive and efficient. The conventional argument is to point to the raised profile of a World Heritage Site and the symbolic capital this represents. This is essentially an argument of leverage, based upon the premise that the site will attract financial resources because of the public and political recognition attained. But this would appear to be more a working assumption than any scientific argument. Anecdotally, World Heritage Sites seem to struggle with models of financial sustainability, and in line with many other heritage sites, are located in the realm of public subsidy by virtue of their more intangibly expressed non-use values within the public policy domain. And here is one of the key paradoxical issues relating to the being on the World Heritage List. Designating a site as World Heritage is founded upon a particular notion of value, collectively expressed and endorsed to the signatories to the convention. The concept of outstanding universal value is accepted as being the measure to demarcate World Heritage from other heritage. However, this is largely considered as a form of intrinsic value, and it treats sites and properties as essential non-market goods. And yet, once a site has been accorded this value, in material terms it bears the logo, it becomes marketable. It is this branding process which appears to generate touristic interest, or at least increased touristic interest. Symbolic value is bestowed upon a site by virtue of the processes, narratives and discourses drawn from the convention and played out by designated individuals and organisations. This brand value can stimulate visits to the sites, and in various forms and formats can be transformed into economic value. And this can be dramatic, as in the well-cited example of the Iwami Jinzan silver mine, which is on Honshu Island in Japan, where before it was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2007, attracted 15,000 visitors a year, and in 2008 it attracted nearly 1 million visitors. There are, of course, less dramatic examples, and others where the label of World Heritage has produced little or no effect. Indeed, the vast majority of the 981 World Heritage Sites are not very alluring to tourists at all. There are many reasons for this, too many to go into, but they reflect not only the surface issues of difficult physical access and poor marketing, but deeper clashes of values and socio-cultural meaning. The country of Jordan has 4 World Heritage Sites. Petra, the Red Rose City of the Nabateans, inscribed in 1985, is the one that most of us will have heard of, along with Wadi Rum, most recently inscribed and familiar to us from its supporting role in the movie Lawrence of Arabia. Its other listed sites are the desert castle of Kosiamra and Umarasas, a former Roman Byzantine settlement noted for the mosaics of St. Stephen's Church. In 2009, the number of visitors to Petra was approximately 780,000. Ironically, many of these were generated as a result of Petra being named as one of the new world wonders. At Umarasas, a generous estimate of visitors in 2009 would be around 9,000, with many of these being school visits and archaeological tours. During a visit to Umarasas in 2008, I witnessed the construction of a large and optimistically conceived visitor centre at this remote location. The locals seemed to enthusiastically welcome the visitor centre, not least because the building was providing employment and it was being part-funded through a European Union programme. But also the promise of tourists coming to what is a very depressed area of the country. One of the people I talked with at the site was a local community health worker who knew of the area's long-standing problems. He posed a rhetorical but pointed question when he said, "How do we address the problems of this community when all we have are piles of stones?" Now, this is not an untypical view amongst many World Heritage communities, including those in the UK. The relationship that the local community has in Asas is not a negative one. Indeed, locals are generally proud of the apparent international recognition for this site. They are certainly welcoming of visitors, which come and are generally respectful of the site and the archaeological work which goes on there. But behind this searching and serious question, there are a host of other questions which are often not fully articulated or struggle to be heard. An initial question refers to what I term the Star Trek effect, which refers to how a site suddenly comes into the world. Of course, it is not suddenly beamed into existence, and is often the outcome of a long process. But for communities which have not been engaged in this process, it might as well have been beamed into existence. While there are many signs of various sorts of World Heritage sites which address the history and architecture of the buildings and monuments, I am yet to see one which explains to me, as a tourist, and more importantly to the local population, why this is a World Heritage site and how it became such. This also goes for tour guides whose official narratives remain seemingly trapped in long descriptions of architectural styles without telling me why this is a World Heritage site. This obvious process of communication is provided for in the Convention, particularly under Articles 27 and 28. Well, there's much work to be done by state parties, proactively directed by UNESCO and IUCN, to help explain the hows and whys of sites, not only to heritage enthusiasts, not only to tourists, but to local communities and wider society. And the question I remember from my fleeting acquaintance with this man in remote Jordan is to me indicative of a disenchantment, actual and potential, with World Heritage. Indeed, many aspects of authorised heritage amongst communities around the world. When speaking of an inventory of nearly 1,000 sites across the globe, I am well aware of the generalisation trap in all directions. But in developing economies, and still with the aftershock of economic uncertainty and repositioning within developed countries also, and indeed within the context of UNESCO's own financial problems, there is a need to reassess the World Heritage category and process, not within its own terms of reference, but in relation to the wider context of social, cultural and economic change. A key issue here is that there is a strong sense in which World Heritage is seen to be an endpoint in itself. Somewhat distant, even remote from wider social goals. And it is important to make the distinction between the evaluation of the site and its value. The evaluation process which takes place despite its objective ideal invariably can lapse into issues of taste, which is more articulated more by Bourdieu than by Kant. In addition, it is frequently coloured by politics played out at local and global level. The making of World Heritage is, through the quasi-rational interpretation of the term, outstanding universal value, chiefly an evaluation. The process tells us whether a heritage site gains status or not. The values which count in this case are what I would term integral. That is, they are of the object. Now we can continue to debate issues of validity, expression, communication and efficacy with regard to evaluation and designation, but this does not address the question of what do we do with it. How do we close the distance between having World Heritage in the world and extracting the value we accord to it and which is actually capable of accumulating? This involves setting an agenda for World Heritage which is far more pragmatic and utilitarian in its approach. It was John Dewey who said that value was a function not of whim nor purely of social construction, but a quality situated in events. Dewey, of course, was primarily focused upon art and its integrity within culture and everyday experience, but the parallel, I think, is rather obvious. To paraphrase Dewey, world heritage needs to be part of everyone's lives and not just the privilege of any particular group. There is no automatic route to universal acceptance. The term world needs to mean the world is constituted by its people and the rest of the stuff around it. To draw upon another pragmatist, Richard Rorty, we need to move beyond the mere vocabulary of value and perform it. World heritage is a total social fact. We cannot disinvent it, nor should we. But despite the fact that we have spent over 40 years creating it, remarkably, we know precious little about its impact and its implications. We know much about the objects of world heritage and the process that make them such, but we know precious little about how communities of interest, locals, tourists, policymakers in the wider economy, etc., encounter and engage with them. How do we make sense of world heritage? What does it contribute to identities at local, national and regional level? In relation to the myriad of other heritage forms and formats, what meanings does it convey? We need to better understand the languages of engagement, the ways in which communities encounter and process the meanings that are encoded within world heritage. Again, the emphasis is not upon the material structures of heritage, but rather upon the relationships, actual and potential, it shares with its audience, super and diverse as it is. Translating heritage is no longer about shouting louder, but about finding genuine connections. To what extent does world heritage displace other heritage forms? What good does it do? What good can it do? How can we implicate world heritage in wider projects of social and economic development? This is not a hint towards some kind of neoliberalist strategy for what clearly does have value and import for the world above the forces of the market. But rather it is a steer towards a world heritage site which delivers a more pragmatic and utilitarian value beyond itself. In other words, seeing world heritage not as an end in itself, but as a means to other ends. These other ends will vary from site to site, state to state, but critically, one would assume they need to be aligned with the Millennium Development Goals. The 8 goals, which are approaching their 2015 deadline, are meant to underpin all of UNESCO's strategies. And yet I do not see the links between world heritage and the development agenda as being very well developed. There are, of course, other ends and priorities which ebb and flow in relation to global and local events. And of course there are other UNESCO conventions with which the World Heritage Convention is not well aligned with the 2003 Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage, itself a philosophical and political challenge, we are in danger of repeating the problems that beset the World Heritage List. I would argue we need new intimacies with world heritage. A cognitive or intellectual intimacy that will allow a breaking down of boundaries between a concern for sites and objects and what these actually mean within the cross-cultural currents that flow around us. An experiential intimacy that allows active involvement with world heritage as a focus for education, economy and social action. And ultimately, an emotional intimacy that will allow closer personal engagement with sites as emblematic of questions of history, society and politics. UNESCO is beginning to take a more instrumental view of world heritage. In its programme of sustainable tourism, for instance, it is seeking to implicate sites at the centre of local economies and communities. It has begun to see the value of its own brand and the need to educate a wider public in the meaning of world heritage so that it can actually protect this thing called outstanding universal value. And while cynics may see this as too little too late and an inadequate response to an extensive self-generated global system of elite heritage, we are, as they say, where we are. We have opportunities to firmly embed world heritage into everyday life, back to where it came from, so to speak, so that it does not resemble disconnected islands of the past floating around in a sea of future expectation. We need to demonstrate that heritage, and world heritage in particular, while being of the past, can play a role in the building of futures. And all of this brings me back to the Ironbridge International Institute for Cultural Heritage and my building programme, and the extensive research and policy agenda that we need to engage with. It is an agenda that clearly needs to be international and thematically inclusive, linking questions of world heritage with other categories of heritage, cultural heritage and natural heritage, tangible with intangible heritage. It is also a research agenda that is multi and cross-disciplinary. And I hope that during this lecture I have demonstrated that within the realms of world heritage alone, important issues are raised that relate not only to economics, law and politics, but to philosophy, anthropology, sociology, linguistics and geography. Focusing on heritage and its close companion tourism requires us to address searching questions relating to both historical and contemporary contexts, to issues of colonialism, nationalism, power, translation, mobilities, memory, narrative, identity, religion, representation, media and development. And in the Ironbridge Gorge World Heritage Site, known for its creativity both in the early 18th century and today, we have an amazing laboratory and a strong partnership that can feed into and feed off our research agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that we can continue to work together on this exciting agenda, and I thank you all very much for listening to me. Thank you very much.